"You look like a beggar," my wife whispered as she poured leftovers on my shirt in the lobby. Her lover just stood there smiling. They rushed inside to sign the $800 million deal, but when the CEO's chair spun around, I was sitting there with a special gift. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought a container of leftover Chinese food could destroy what was left of my dignity, but there I was, standing in the marble lobby of Sterling Corporate Tower with sweet and sour sauce dripping from my shirt collar onto my worn leather shoes. "You look like a beggar," Mia whispered, but her voice carried just loud enough for the security guards and the handful of executives nearby to hear. The contempt in her tone was nothing new, but the public nature of this humiliation felt different. Final. I stood there, 58 years old, watching my wife of 29 years tilt the white takeout container until the last bits of rice and sauce splattered across my chest. The lobby smelled like expensive coffee and imported marble cleaner, but now it reeked of cold Chinese food and my own embarrassment. David Hartwell, the man my wife had been seeing for the past 5 years, stood beside her with that smug smile I'd grown to know so well. He didn't even try to hide his amusement. "Really, Thomas," Mia said, brushing an imaginary speck from her designer blazer, "couldn't you have at least tried to look presentable? We're about to close an $800 million deal, and you show up looking like you've been sleeping in your car." I hadn't been sleeping in my car, though there were nights I'd considered it. I'd driven here from our house in Westchester, the same route I'd taken hundreds of times over the years, except this time I'd brought lunch to share with my wife. How naive of me to think she might want to spend 20 minutes talking like we used to, back when she still looked at me like I was worth something. The container fell from her perfectly manicured fingers and clattered against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the lobby like a gunshot. A few people turned to stare, then quickly looked away when they realized they were witnessing something private and painful. "Mia," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the hum of conversation and clicking heels around us. "I just thought we could have lunch together." She laughed, but there was no warmth in it. There hadn't been warmth in anything she'd said to me for years. "Lunch? Thomas, do you see where we are?" She gestured around the lobby with its soaring ceilings and gleaming surfaces. "This is where successful people work, important people, not—" She looked me up and down, her green eyes cold as winter. "Not whatever you've become." David stepped closer to her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. He was 45, 3 years younger than my wife, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money or respect or whether your spouse will acknowledge your existence at a dinner party. "Maybe you should head home, Thomas," David said, his voice smooth and condescending. "Mia and I have important business to attend to." Important business. I almost laughed at that. If only they knew how important. If only they understood that the man they were about to meet, the CEO they'd been courting for months to secure this $800 million contract, had been watching this entire humiliation unfold from the security cameras upstairs. But they didn't know. They had no idea. I touched my vintage gold watch, the one my father had given me before he died, the one that had belonged to his father before him. The metal was warm against my wrist, a small comfort in this moment of complete degradation. Mia used to love this watch. She used to trace the intricate engravings with her fingertip when we lay in bed on Sunday mornings, back when Sunday mornings meant something to both of us. "I'll clean up," I said, looking down at the mess of food and sauce on my shirt, on the floor, on what was left of my pride. "Don't bother," Mia said, already turning toward the elevator bank with David. "The cleaning crew will handle it. It's what they're paid for." I watched them walk away, Mia's heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Her hair was perfect, as always, styled in that expensive way that cost more than most people made in a week. Her suit was tailored to fit her like a second skin, probably costing more than the monthly salary she thought I earned as a consultant. The elevator doors opened, and just before they stepped inside, David turned back to look at me. His smile was triumphant, victorious. He thought he'd won something. He thought he understood what was happening here. He had no idea what was about to happen upstairs. As the elevator doors closed, I stood alone in the lobby with sauce staining my shirt and the weight of 29 years of marriage pressing down on my shoulders like a stone. The security guards had stopped pretending not to watch. A few executives whispered among themselves, probably wondering who the pathetic man was and why he'd been allowed into their sanctuary of success. I pulled out my phone and wiped sauce from the screen. 3 missed calls, all from my assistant. She was probably wondering where I was, why I was late for the most important meeting of the quarter. The meeting that would determine whether Hartwell Industries would secure the contract they'd been chasing for 18 months. The meeting where Mia and David would finally meet the real Thomas Mitchell. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward the men's room to clean myself up as best I could. My reflection in the mirror was grim, tired, older than my 58 years. The sauce had left a dark stain across my chest that looked like blood in the fluorescent lighting. But my eyes held something that hadn't been there in years, something that had been buried under decades of small humiliations and quiet disappointments, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. As I dabbed at the stain with paper towels, I thought about the brown leather briefcase sitting in my car, the one containing documents that would change everything, the one containing proof of who I really was, what I'd really built while my wife spent my money and my business partner plotted to steal my contracts. I thought about the chair on the 46th floor, the one behind the mahogany desk in the corner office with the panoramic view of Manhattan, the chair that had been waiting for me to claim it publicly for the first time, the chair that Mia and David were about to see me sitting in. I finished cleaning the sauce from my shirt as best I could, straightened my tie, and checked my watch. They'd had enough time to get comfortable in the conference room, enough time to review their proposal one last time, enough time to count the $800 million they thought they were about to earn. Time to show them exactly who they'd been underestimating all these years. Standing in that sterile bathroom, scrubbing sweet and sour sauce from my shirt, my mind drifted back to when things were different. When Mia used to look at me like I hung the moon instead of like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. It was 1995 when we got married. I was 29, she was 23, and I was already building something she never bothered to understand. Back then, she called my work ethic admirable. She'd bring me coffee when I worked late in our tiny apartment, kiss my forehead when I fell asleep over spreadsheets and business plans. "You're going to change the world," she used to say, curled up against me on our second-hand couch. She wasn't wrong. I just changed it more quietly than she expected. The real irony was that Mia had been living off my success for decades without knowing it. Every designer handbag, every spa weekend, every first-class vacation to Europe had been funded by the empire I'd built in the shadows. An empire I'd deliberately kept invisible, using shell companies and trusted associates as the public faces while I controlled everything from behind the scenes. Mitchell Holdings, Sterling Industries, Apex Development Corporation, 3 companies that most people thought were owned by other people, but every major decision flowed through me. Every contract, every acquisition, every $800 million deal that ambitious executives like David Hartwell spent months trying to secure. I'd learned early that being underestimated was more powerful than being feared. While other CEOs posed for magazine covers and gave interviews about their business philosophies, I worked in silence. I let other people take the credit while I collected the profits. It was a strategy that had made me one of the wealthiest men in Manhattan, and it was also the reason my wife treated me like a failure. The transformation had been gradual. When I lost my corporate job in 2008, Mia had been supportive at first. "We'll figure it out together," she'd said, holding my hand across our kitchen table while I explained that the company was downsizing and I'd been let go after 15 years. What she didn't know was that I'd been planning my exit for months. I'd seen the writing on the wall, and more importantly, I'd been building my own companies on the side. The severance package they offered me was pocket change compared to what I was already earning from my ventures, but I let everyone, including Mia, believe that money was tight. It was a test, I told myself. I wanted to see if she'd love me without the steady paycheck, the corporate title, the respect that came with being a vice president at a Fortune 500 company. I wanted to know if she'd stand by me while I built something real, something that belonged to us. The answer came slowly, like watching paint peel from a wall. First, she stopped asking about my day. Then she stopped cooking dinner when I was working late. By 2010, she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring to social events, claiming it didn't match her outfits. That was around the time she started making comments about my appearance, my prospects, my apparent inability to get back on track. She'd compare me to her friends' husbands, successful men who worked in visible careers, men whose accomplishments could be measured in office size and parking space proximity. Jennifer's husband just got promoted to partner, she'd say over breakfast, not looking up from her phone. They're buying a house in the Hamptons. What she didn't know was that I'd bought that house. Not directly, but through one of my companies. I owned the development company that built the entire neighborhood where Jennifer and her husband were so proud to live. The cruelest part was watching her spend money she thought came from my consulting work. I'd told her I was making $8,000 a month as a freelance business consultant, a deliberately modest amount that would explain our comfortable lifestyle without raising questions about where the real money came from. $8,000 a month when I was actually generating millions. She'd roll her eyes when I mentioned a new client, never asking for details because she'd already decided my work wasn't worth her attention. Meanwhile, she was planning $50,000 kitchen renovations and booking European vacations that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "We can afford it," she'd say when I'd gently question a particularly expensive purchase. "The inheritance from your father is still covering most of our expenses." Father had left me $50,000 when he died. That money had been gone within the first year of our marriage, spent on the down payment for our house in Westchester. But I let her believe we were living off inheritance money because it was easier than explaining the truth. The truth was too complicated, too unbelievable. How do you tell your wife that while she's been treating you like a disappointment, you've been quietly building a business empire worth over $2 billion? How do you explain that every morning when she leaves the house in her luxury car, headed to her yoga classes and shopping appointments, you're going to work as the silent owner of companies that employ thousands of people? How do you tell someone that their contempt has been funding their lifestyle? The breaking point should have come years ago, but I kept hoping she'd remember who I used to be to her. I kept thinking that if I was patient enough, loyal enough, she'd see past the facade I'd created and love me again. Instead, she found David Hartwell, the ambitious vice president at a mid-tier investment firm who drove a leased BMW and wore suits that were expensive enough to impress, but not so expensive that anyone would question where the money came from. David, who took her to restaurants I owned through subsidiary companies and bought her jewelry with money he'd borrowed against future commissions. David, who had no idea that the $800 million contract he'd been chasing for 18 months would only be approved if I personally signed off on it. I finished cleaning my shirt and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. 58 years old, graying at the temples with lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when Mia and I were young and dreaming of building a life together. But my posture was straight, my hands were steady, and for the first time in years I felt like myself again. My phone buzzed with another call from my assistant. Margaret had been with me for 12 years, one of the few people who knew the full scope of what I'd built. She'd watched me suffer through Mia's increasing disdain, had fielded calls from my wife, demanding to know why I was working so late, when I was actually running board meetings for companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Sir?" Margaret's voice was crisp and professional when I answered. "Mrs. Mitchell and Mr. Hartwell are in conference room A. They've been waiting for 8 minutes. "Let them wait a little longer," I said, adjusting my tie. "I'll be up in 5 minutes. "And the documents?" I thought about the brown leather briefcase in my car, the one containing not just the contracts David was hoping to sign, but also the divorce papers my lawyer had prepared, the financial disclosures that would show Mia exactly how much money she'd been spending without knowing where it came from, and, most importantly, the evidence about David's own financial situation. Evidence that would prove he wasn't the successful businessman he pretended to be. Evidence that would show he was actually drowning in debt, using credit cards to fund his lifestyle, and banking on this contract to save him from bankruptcy. "Have them ready," I said. "All of them." I walked out of the bathroom and toward the elevator, my steps echoing in the marble lobby where my wife had just humiliated me in front of strangers. The security guards nodded respectfully as I passed, though they had no idea they were greeting the man who paid their salaries. As the elevator carried me toward the 46th floor, toward the corner office where my wife and her lover were waiting to meet the CEO they thought they didn't know, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. The elevator climbed toward the 46th floor, each floor bringing me closer to a moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day Mia first looked at me with disappointment instead of love. The numbers on the display panel flickered past, 23, 24, 25, each one marking another step away from the man who'd just been humiliated in the lobby, and toward the man I'd always been behind the scenes. Margaret was waiting when the doors opened, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her expression professionally neutral despite what I knew she was thinking. She'd witnessed enough of Mia's phone calls over the years to understand exactly what kind of woman my wife had become. "Conference room A," she said simply, falling into step beside me as we walked down the hallway lined with original artwork that most people assumed belonged to Sterling Industries, but had actually been purchased through one of my personal holding companies. "How do they seem?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why it mattered. Nothing they could say or do would change what was about to happen. "Confident," Margaret replied, her voice carrying just a hint of irony. "Mr. Hartwell has been explaining to your wife how important this meeting is, how much this contract will change their lives." Their lives. As if they were a team. As if David Hartwell was anything more than a desperate man drowning in debt who'd latched onto my wife because he thought she had money. We stopped outside the conference room, and through the glass walls I could see them. Mia sat with her back straight, her designer blazer immaculate, completely unaware that she was sitting in a chair I'd personally selected when we designed this floor 3 years ago. David paced near the window, gesticulating as he spoke, his movements quick and nervous despite the confidence Margaret had mentioned. "The documents?" I asked. Margaret handed me a thin manila folder. Inside were copies of everything David thought he'd hidden. Credit card statements showing debts totaling over $400,000. Bank records proving his checking account had been overdrawn 6 times in the past 2 months. Loan applications that had been rejected by 4 different institutions. Most damaging of all, copies of emails he'd sent to potential investors, emails where he'd claimed to be in a relationship with a wealthy woman whose family money would help secure his business ventures. He'd been selling Mia as collateral for investments he couldn't secure on his own merit. And Mrs. Mitchell's documents? The second folder was thicker. 29 years of marriage had generated a substantial paper trail, but the most relevant documents were recent. Bank statements showing that every dollar in our joint accounts came from my companies. Property records proving that the house she considered theirs was actually owned by a trust controlled entirely by me. Investment portfolios she'd never seen because she'd never asked, all managed through my financial advisors. The final document in the folder was one she'd signed without reading, as was her habit with anything that looked too legal or complicated. A post-nuptial agreement we'd updated 5 years ago when I'd restructured some of my holdings for tax purposes. An agreement that gave her essentially nothing in the event of a divorce caused by infidelity. She'd signed it while planning a spa weekend with her friends, barely glancing at the pages I'd told her were routine financial updates. "Shall I announce you?" Margaret asked. I straightened my tie, the same tie I'd been wearing when my wife poured food on me 30 minutes ago. The stain was barely visible now, but I could still smell the faint sweetness of the sauce. "No," I said. "I'll announce myself." Margaret nodded and retreated to her desk. I stood alone outside the conference room, watching my wife and her lover prepare for a meeting they thought would secure their future. David had opened his briefcase and was reviewing documents, probably rehearsing his pitch one final time. Mia checked her reflection in the black screen of her phone, adjusting her hair with the same careful attention she'd given her appearance for the past 5 years whenever she was meeting someone she considered important. She'd stopped caring about her appearance around me sometime in 2015. I could pinpoint the exact moment because it was the same week she'd started working late on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the same week she'd begun receiving text messages that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen in years. Through the glass, I watched David lean over and whisper something in her ear. She laughed, a genuine laugh full of warmth and affection. I couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that with me. Maybe our anniversary dinner in 2012, back when she still pretended to be interested in our marriage. My phone buzzed with a text message from my lawyer confirming that all the divorce documents were ready for filing. All that remained was my signature and the decision to move forward. After what had happened in the lobby, after watching my wife humiliate me in public while planning to profit from my success with another man, that decision felt inevitable. But first, they needed to understand exactly what they were losing. I thought about the Sterling Industries annual report sitting on David's desk in his cramped office 15 blocks away. He'd highlighted sections about our company's growth, our expansion into new markets, our plans for the future. What he didn't know was that every highlighted passage had been written by consultants I'd hired, every growth strategy had been developed by teams I'd assembled, every future plan had been approved by me. Sterling Industries existed because I'd created it. The $800 million contract existed because I'd negotiated the underlying deals that made it possible. The impressive revenue figures that had caught David's attention existed because I'd spent 8 years systematically acquiring smaller companies and folding them into a portfolio that now employed over 12,000 people. David Hartwell thought he was meeting with some anonymous CEO who'd been impressed by his proposal. He had no idea he was about to sit across from the man whose wife he'd been sleeping with for 5 years. I opened the conference room door without knocking. They both turned toward me, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to confusion. David's mouth was open, mid-sentence in whatever he'd been saying to Mia. She blinked twice, as if trying to process why her husband was walking into her important business meeting. "Thomas?" Her voice was sharp with annoyance. "What are you doing here? Security was supposed to escort you out." I closed the door behind me and walked toward the head of the conference table, the chair that had been mine since we'd built this building. Both of them watched me move, still not understanding what was happening. "I'm sorry," David said, standing up and straightening his suit jacket. "I think there's been some mistake. We're waiting for the CEO of Sterling Industries." I pulled out the chair and sat down, setting my folders on the table in front of me. The leather was soft and familiar under my hands, worn smooth from years of use during meetings they'd never known I was having. "No mistake," I said, looking directly at my wife. "You found him." The color drained from Mia's face. David looked from her to me and back again, his confidence evaporating like steam. For the first time in 5 years, I had their complete, undivided attention. "That's impossible," Mia whispered. "You're a consultant. You make $8,000 a month, you work from home." I opened the first folder and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the polished table toward her. My name was embossed in gold letters: Thomas Mitchell, Chief Executive Officer, Sterling Industries. "I do work from home sometimes," I said calmly. "It's one of the advantages of owning the company." David sank back into his chair, his briefcase full of proposals suddenly worthless. Mia stared at the business card as if it were written in a foreign language. "This is some kind of joke," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and called Margaret. "Please bring in the contract files for Hartwell Industries," I said, never taking my eyes off my wife's face. "Right away, Mr. Mitchell," Margaret's voice came through the speaker, loud enough for both of them to hear the respectful tone, the easy familiarity of someone who'd been taking orders from me for over a decade. Mia's hands were shaking now. David had gone completely silent, probably calculating how badly he'd miscalculated everything. 29 years, I said to Mia. 29 years you've been spending my money, living in my house, sleeping in my bed, all while treating me like I was some kind of failure. Margaret knocked and entered, carrying a stack of files that represented 18 months of David's work, courting a contract from a company I owned. She set them down in front of me and left without a word. Every vacation you've taken, I continued, opening the top file, every designer dress, every spa treatment, every expensive dinner you've shared with Mr. Hartwell here, all of it paid for with money from companies you never knew I owned. I pulled out a photograph from David's file, one taken by a private investigator 6 months ago. It showed him and Mia leaving Giuseppe's restaurant, the same restaurant where I'd proposed to her 30 years ago. They were holding hands, laughing, completely unaware they were being watched. "Did you know," I said, sliding the photograph across the table, "that I own Giuseppe's? I bought it 3 years ago when the original owner wanted to retire. So every romantic dinner you've been having there, every bottle of champagne you've been sharing, every moment you've been planning your future together, I've been paying for all of it." The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, but inside this conference room, time seemed frozen. Finally, David found his voice. "The contract won't be signed," I finished for him, "at least not by you." I reached for the second folder, the one containing everything I'd learned about David Hartwell's real financial situation. It was time to show them exactly what kind of man my wife had chosen to replace me with. The silence stretched between us, like a taut wire ready to snap. Mia stared at the photograph of herself and David, her face cycling through expressions I hadn't seen in years. Shock, fear, and something that might have been shame if she were capable of feeling it. David's hands were flat on the conference table, his knuckles white with tension. "Look, Mr. Mitchell, I had no idea you were married to—" "Stop!" My voice cut through his excuse like a blade. "We both know that's not true." I opened the second folder, the thick one containing David's financial records. The papers rustled in the silence as I spread them across the mahogany table like a dealer laying out cards in a poker game where only I knew what everyone was holding. David Hartwell, I read from the top document. Visa card ending in 4791. Current balance, $63,412. Minimum payment, 60 days overdue. David's face went gray. Mia looked from the papers to him and back again, her perfect composure finally cracking. MasterCard ending in 8835, I continued. Balance $97,608, also overdue. I looked up at my wife. "Did you know about any of this when you were helping him pick out that Rolex he's wearing?" Mia's eyes darted to David's wrist, where a watch that probably cost $30,000 caught the light from the conference room windows. A watch that I now realized she'd likely bought for him with money from our joint account. "Chase Bank checking account," I said, pulling out another sheet. "Overdrawn 6 times in the past 8 weeks. Average balance for the year, negative $243. "That's private information," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you get—" "I get whatever information I need about people who want to do business with my companies," I said. "It's called due diligence, something you might have heard of if you were actually good at your job." I pulled out a longer document, several pages stapled together. But this is my favorite part. Loan applications to 4 different banks over the past year, all rejected. And do you know why they were rejected, David? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because you listed my wife as a financial reference. You told them you were in a relationship with someone who had substantial family wealth that could serve as collateral for your debts. I looked at Mia, whose mouth had fallen open. You've been using her as a credit reference while she's been using you as an escape from a marriage she thought was worthless. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. David thought he was latching onto a wealthy woman, and Mia thought she was trading up to a successful man. They'd both been living in a fantasy built on lies and assumptions. "The thing is," I continued, "Mia doesn't have any family wealth. She never did. Her parents died when she was 25 and left her exactly $12,000 and a 1990 Honda Civic with a broken air conditioner." Mia's breathing had become shallow and quick. 29 years of marriage, and she was finally learning where her comfortable lifestyle had actually come from. "Every dollar she's spent for the past 3 decades has come from me. Every credit card payment, every mortgage payment, every insurance premium, all of it funded by companies she never knew I owned." I pulled out a bank statement from our joint account. "Even the money she's been spending on you, David. The dinners, the gifts, the weekend trips to the Hamptons, all my money." I watched David process this information, watched him realize that the woman he'd been courting for her wealth was actually just another person living off my success. "But here's the really special part," I said, reaching into my briefcase for a final folder. "My gift to both of you." The folder contained copies of emails David had sent over the past year. Emails I'd obtained through entirely legal means once I'd started investigating him as a potential business partner. "These are messages you sent to Marcus Webb at Pinnacle Investments," I said, sliding copies across the table. "In them, you describe your relationship with Mia as a strategic partnership that would provide access to family money for future ventures." Mia snatched the papers and read them, her face growing paler with each line. David had described her as his financial backing, had promised investors that her inheritance would secure their investments in his failing consulting business. "And these," I said, producing another set of emails, "are the messages you sent to Patricia Chen at Liberty Capital. You told her that your wealthy girlfriend was naive about business and that you could easily access her resources for your investment proposals." The papers trembled in Mia's hands. David had been planning to use her, had been describing her to potential business partners as an easy mark, a wealthy woman too stupid to understand how he was manipulating her. "You called me naive," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. "You told them I was stupid." "Mia," David started, reaching for her hand, but she jerked away from him. "But that's not the best part," I said, enjoying this more than I'd expected to. "The best part is what you wrote to Kevin Morrison at Hartwell Industries last month." I pulled out one final email, the one that had made me laugh out loud when my investigator had shown it to me. David had written to his own boss explaining that he was cultivating a relationship with the wife of a failed businessman and that she would never suspect she was being used because she was too embarrassed by her husband's lack of success to pay attention to financial details. "You were planning to steal from me," Mia said, staring at David as if she was seeing him for the first time. "You were going to take my money and disappear." "It's not your money," I said quietly. "It never was. But yes, that was his plan." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to listen to this. There's no way you can prove—" "Sit down," I said, and something in my voice made him obey immediately. I pulled out my phone and pressed a number. "Margaret, please send security to Conference Room A and call Detective Morrison at the Financial Crimes Unit. Tell him we have those documents ready." "Right away, Mr. Mitchell." David's face went white. "Financial crimes?" "Wire fraud," I said calmly. "Using false information to obtain loans. It's a federal offense, especially when the amounts involved exceed $50,000. I gathered all the papers and returned them to their folders. "Every loan application you submitted with Mia listed as a reference contained false information. Every email you sent promising investors access to her money constituted fraud. The FBI takes this kind of thing very seriously." Through the conference room windows, I could see security guards approaching down the hallway. David saw them too and started toward the door, but I spoke again. "I wouldn't run if I were you. That just makes it worse." "Thomas," Mia said, her voice small and broken. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was planning." "I know you didn't," I said, and for the first time since this meeting began, my voice softened slightly. "You were just as much his victim as anyone else. The difference is, You were also my wife when you decided to betray our marriage." The security guards knocked on the door. Through the glass, I could see Detective Morrison behind them, a man I'd worked with before when we'd had issues with embezzlement at one of my other companies. "The divorce papers are already prepared," I said to Mia. "You can sign them voluntarily, or we can do this the difficult way, but either way, this marriage is over." She nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "The house belongs to a trust I control. You'll have 30 days to remove your personal belongings." I stood up, straightening my jacket. "The joint bank accounts will be closed today. You'll receive a settlement check for $50,000, which is more generous than the prenuptial agreement requires given the circumstances. $50,000, the same amount her parents had left her 29 years ago. It felt appropriate." "My lawyer will explain the rest," I said. "You'll be comfortable, but you'll need to find work. Real work, not the volunteer positions you've been treating like hobbies." The security guards entered, followed by Detective Morrison. David looked around the room like a trapped animal, finally understanding that he'd walked into a trap months in the making. "Mr. Hartwell," Detective Morrison said, "we'd like to ask you some questions about loan applications you've submitted over the past year." As they led David away, he turned back to look at Mia one last time. But she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at me, seeing me clearly for the first time in decades. "29 years, she whispered. "You let me think you were nothing for 29 years. "I let you think whatever you wanted to think," I said. "I hoped you'd love me anyway." And when I didn't, I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the door. When you didn't, I learned to love myself enough to stop needing you to. The conference room fell silent behind me as I walked away, leaving my wife to face the consequences of choices she'd made long before David Hartwell had entered our lives. Choices about respect, about loyalty, about what kind of person she wanted to be. For the first time in years, I felt completely, genuinely free. 3 days after the confrontation at Sterling Industries, I sat in my lawyer's office watching Mia sign the divorce papers with trembling hands. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the simple black dress she wore instead of her usual designer outfits. "The settlement amount is final," Jonathan Reeves, my attorney, explained as she initialed each page. $50,000 as specified in the post-nuptial agreement. The house, cars, and all other assets remain with Mr. Mitchell. Mia nodded without speaking. She hadn't said much of anything since David's arrest had made the local news. "Local investment executive charged with wire fraud" had been the headline in the business section, accompanied by a photo of him being led away in handcuffs. The article mentioned his alleged scheme to defraud investors using false claims about family connections to wealth. It didn't mention Mia by name, but everyone in our social circle knew who David's wealthy girlfriend had been. "The joint accounts have been closed," Jonathan continued. "Your personal credit cards linked to those accounts are no longer valid. You'll need to establish your own banking relationships going forward." She looked up at that, panic flickering in her green eyes. "All of them? Even the American Express?" "All of them," I confirmed. "The platinum card you used to book your spa weekends was connected to my business accounts. So was the Visa you used for your shopping trips to Manhattan." The reality was hitting her in waves. For 29 years, she'd lived without ever thinking about money, never questioning where it came from or whether it would continue flowing. She'd treated credit cards like magic wands that made expensive things appear without consequences. "I don't understand how this is legal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Half of everything should be mine. Community property. Doesn't apply when the assets were placed in trusts and corporations before the marriage," Jonathan explained patiently. "Assets that were built through Mr. Mitchell's work during the marriage, but held separately according to the post-nuptial agreement you signed." The post-nuptial agreement. I watched her face as she remembered signing it, probably thinking it was just another stack of boring paperwork I'd asked her to deal with. She'd been planning a girls' trip to Napa Valley at the time, more interested in restaurant reservations than legal documents. "You planned this," she said, looking at me with something between admiration and horror. You've been planning this for years. I planned for the possibility, said. I hoped I'd never need to use it. The truth was more complicated than that. I hadn't planned for divorce specifically, but I'd learned early in my business career to protect my assets. When my companies started generating serious money, I'd structured everything to minimize taxes and legal exposure. The fact that those same structures now protected me in divorce proceedings was just a fortunate side effect. But there was something else, something I hadn't admitted even to myself until recently. Part of me had been preparing for this moment since 2010, when Mia's treatment of me had shifted from disappointment to active contempt. I'd watched her choose designer shoes over our marriage, watched her prioritize status over loyalty, and I'd quietly built walls around everything I'd worked to create. "Where will you go?" I asked, and I was surprised to find that I genuinely cared about the answer. She shrugged, a gesture so unlike her usual precise movements that it made her look like a stranger. "My sister's house in Connecticut, I guess, until I figure things out." Her sister Karen, the high school principal who'd always disapproved of Mia's lifestyle, Karen who'd made pointed comments about living beyond your means at family gatherings for years. Mia would hate every minute of staying there, but it was probably her only option. "And work?" Jonathan asked, making notes on his legal pad. "I don't know." Mia's voice cracked slightly. "I haven't worked since before we were married. I don't even know what I'm qualified to do." She had a college degree in art history, something that had seemed romantic and sophisticated when we were young. But 29 years of charity luncheons and yoga classes didn't translate into marketable job skills. "There are placement agencies," I said, "companies that help people transition back into the workforce." She looked at me sharply. "You've researched that too?" "I've researched everything that might help you land on your feet," I admitted. "This doesn't have to destroy you, Mia. You're smart, you're educated, you can rebuild." "As what? A secretary? A sales clerk?" Her voice rose, some of her old fire returning. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." The silence that followed was heavy with 29 years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. I thought about all the times I'd tried to share my actual work with her, the excitement I'd felt about building something meaningful, the dreams I'd wanted us to pursue together. She'd never been interested in the details of what I was doing, never asked questions about my projects or goals. She'd wanted the results without the process, the lifestyle without the work that made it possible. "The house will be empty by next week," I said. "I'm having it cleaned and putting it on the market." "You're selling our home?" For the first time since we'd sat down, real emotion broke through her, composed facade. "It was never our home," I said. "It was a house I bought for a woman who stopped wanting to live there with me years ago." She flinched at that, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I loved that house," she whispered. "You loved what it represented," I corrected. "You loved being able to tell people you lived in Westchester, loved hosting dinner parties where you could show off the renovated kitchen and the imported tile work. You never loved the house itself." "That's not true." "When was the last time you sat in the living room without entertaining guests? When was the last time you cooked dinner in that kitchen you spent $40,000 renovating? When was the last time you were happy just to be there?" She couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. She'd turned our house into a stage for the life she wanted people to think she was living, but she'd never actually lived that life. Jonathan cleared his throat. "The final documents will be filed tomorrow. The divorce will be finalized within 60 days. 60 days to end 29 years of marriage. It seemed both too long and not nearly enough time to process everything that had led us to this moment. "There's one more thing," I said, pulling an envelope from my jacket pocket. "I've arranged for you to receive job placement assistance and career counseling, 6 months of support to help you figure out what comes next." Mia stared at the envelope like it might bite her. "Why would you do that?" "Because spite isn't the same thing as justice," I said. "And because I want you to be okay, even if we can't be okay together." She took the envelope with shaking hands. I hurt you so badly. Yes, you did. I don't know how to apologize for that. I stood up, gathering my papers. You don't apologize for it, you learn from it, you become someone who wouldn't make the same choices again. Outside the lawyer's office, Mia and I stood on the sidewalk for what would probably be the last time as husband and wife. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of dying leaves and the promise of winter. "What will you do now?" she asked. I thought about the quiet house in Westchester, empty now except for the memories I'd been carrying alone for too many years. I thought about the companies that would continue running smoothly without the weight of a failing marriage pressing down on my shoulders. "I'm going to live," I said. "Really live, for the first time in a long time." She nodded, tears finally spilling over. "I hope you find someone who deserves you." "I hope you find someone who helps you deserve yourself," I replied. We didn't hug goodbye. We didn't make promises to stay in touch or pretend this was anything other than an ending. She walked toward the subway station, carrying everything she now owned in a single handbag, while I walked toward my car and the rest of my life. For the first time in years, the future felt like something to look forward to rather than something to endure. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Karen, Mia's sister. "She's working at a bookstore," Karen said without preamble. $9 an hour, part-time. She cries every night. I was sitting in my empty house, eating takeout Chinese food from containers that reminded me uncomfortably of that day in the lobby. "Is she okay?" "She's surviving. Barely." Karen's voice was carefully neutral. "She asked me to call you." "What does she want?" "Nothing. She just wanted you to know that she understands now. What she threw away." Karen paused. "She wanted you to know that she's sorry, and that she knows sorry isn't enough." I set down my chopsticks and stared out the window at the garden Mia had hired landscapers to design, but had never actually tended herself. "Tell her I hope things get better for her." "Is that all?" I thought about forgiveness, about second chances, about the kind of man I wanted to be going forward. Tell her that understanding what she lost is the first step toward making sure she never loses anything that important again. After I hung up, I sat in my empty house and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not happiness yet, not the joy that comes with new beginnings, but the deep, quiet satisfaction that comes from finally being free of a weight you'd forgotten you were carrying. Tomorrow, I would start looking for a smaller place to live, something that felt like home instead of a showcase. Tomorrow, I would start thinking about what I actually wanted my life to look like instead of what I thought it should look like. Tonight, I was content to sit in the silence and remember who I was when I wasn't trying to be enough for someone who had decided I never could be. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I met Elena Rodriguez at a volunteer event for a literacy program I'd been quietly funding for years. She was teaching adult reading classes in the evenings after her day job as a middle school librarian, and she had no idea that the man helping her organize donated books was worth over $2 billion. That ignorance was refreshing in ways I couldn't have imagined. "You're very good with people," she said as we packed books into boxes for distribution to community centers around the city. "Have you done this kind of work before?" I was 59 years old, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, my hands dirty from moving boxes of donated textbooks. For the first time in decades, I looked exactly like what I was, a man who had time to help because he'd finally learned the difference between being busy and being purposeful. "I've done a lot of different kinds of work," I said, which was true enough. Elena smiled, and I noticed the way her dark eyes crinkled at the corners, the way her graying hair caught the light from the community center's fluorescent fixtures. She was probably 55, with laugh lines that suggested she'd spent more time being happy than not, and she wore her wedding ring on a chain around her neck. "Widow?" I asked gently, nodding toward the necklace. 3 years now. Cancer." She didn't look sad when she said it, just matter-of-fact in the way people learn to be when they've processed grief and come out the other side. "You?" "Divorced, recently." "I'm sorry." "I'm not," I said. surprised by how true that was. It was the right thing for both of us. Over the following weeks, I found myself looking forward to Thursday evenings at the community center. Elena and I developed an easy rhythm, working together to sort donations and plan curriculum for the adult literacy classes. She never asked what I did for work, never seemed curious about why I was available during regular business hours or how I could afford to volunteer so much time. She was interested in books, in helping people learn to read, in the small satisfaction that came from watching a 60-year-old construction worker sound out his first complete sentence. She was interested in things that mattered in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or impressing anyone. One Thursday evening in late spring, as we were locking up the community center, she asked if I wanted to get coffee. "There's a place around the corner," she said. "Nothing fancy, but they stay open late for the night shift workers." The diner she led me to was the kind of place Mia would have dismissed without a second glance. Vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of use, coffee that came in thick white mugs, pie displayed under glass cases that had seen better years. It was exactly the kind of place where real conversations happened between real people. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said once we'd settled into a booth near the window. "Of course." "Are you running from something or towards something?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "The volunteering, the availability during the day, the way you never talk about your past." She stirred sugar into her coffee, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "People our age usually have more obligations, more ties. You seem very unencumbered." I considered lying, giving her some simplified version of my story that would be easier to digest. But sitting across from this woman who taught children to love books and adults to read them, dishonesty felt impossible. "I spent 30 years building something I thought would make me happy," I said slowly. "A marriage, a business, a life that looked successful from the outside. But I was so focused on building it that I forgot to live it. And now I'm learning what it feels like to choose how I spend my time instead of having it chosen for me." She nodded, sipping her coffee. "My husband used to say that the most expensive thing you can buy is a life you don't want." "He sounds like a wise man." "He was." She smiled, but it was warm rather than sad. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said the most interesting people were the ones who'd figured out how to start over." We talked until the diner closed at midnight, about books and teaching and the particular satisfaction that came from watching someone discover they were capable of more than they'd thought possible. When I walked her to her car, an aging Honda Civic with a "Reading is Fundamental" bumper sticker, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The desire to see someone again, not because I needed anything from them, but simply because their company made the world feel larger and more interesting. "Same time next week?" she asked, keys in her hand. "I'll be there," I said. 3 months later, Elena and I were having dinner at Giuseppe's when she finally asked the question I'd been expecting, since we'd started spending time together outside the community center. "Thomas," she said, setting down her fork and looking at me with those direct, dark eyes, "what exactly do you do for work?" I'd sold the house in Westchester by then and moved into a smaller place in the city, a 2-bedroom apartment with tall windows and built-in bookshelves that Elena had admired during her first visit. I'd also stepped back from the day-to-day operations of my companies, hiring management teams to handle the details while I focused on strategic direction and philanthropic projects. "I own some businesses," I said. "I've been fortunate." "How fortunate?" I could have deflected, could have given her numbers that would be impressive but not overwhelming. Instead, I told her the truth. Very fortunate. More than anyone really needs. She absorbed this information while cutting another bite of her pasta. Giuseppe's had changed since I'd bought it, becoming more family-focused and less pretentious under the new management I'd installed, the kind of place where couples could have honest conversations over simple food. "Does it matter?" I asked when she didn't respond immediately. "The money? No." She looked up at me. "But I want to understand why you've been spending your evenings teaching people to read when you could be doing anything else in the world." Because it's the first thing I've done in years that feels like it matters, I said. Because watching someone learn to read their grandchild a bedtime story is worth more than any business deal I've ever closed. And because you're trying to figure out who you are when you're not trying to prove anything to anyone, she added quietly. Yes. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were small and strong, with calluses from handling books and the kind of practical short nails that came from prioritizing function over appearance. My husband left me everything when he died, she said. The house, his pension, a small life insurance policy. Nothing extravagant, but enough that I could stop working if I wanted to. I keep teaching because I love it, because those kids need someone who believes they can learn anything. I think we might understand each other. 6 months later, I asked Elena to marry me. Not with a ring that cost more than most people's cars, but with my grandmother's simple gold band that had been sitting in a safety deposit box since my father died. I proposed in the community center after our last literacy class of the semester, surrounded by books and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. "Are you sure?" she asked, turning the ring over in her palm. "I'm not going to change. I'm not going to want the big house or the fancy cars or the social events. I like my Honda Civic and my tiny garden and my students who struggle with 3-syllable words." "I'm counting on you not changing," I said. "I like who I am when I'm with you." We were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the same community center where we'd met. Elena wore a simple blue dress she'd bought at a department store. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to volunteer events, with my father's watch and a sense of peace I hadn't felt since I was young enough to believe that love was supposed to be uncomplicated. Mia sent a card which surprised me. Inside, she'd written, "I hope she sees you the way you always deserve to be seen. I'm learning to see myself differently, too. Thank you for that." I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd been promoted to assistant manager at the bookstore, that she was taking night classes in business administration, that she'd started dating a high school teacher who coached basketball and drove a 15-year-old Toyota. She was building a different life than the one she'd lost. A smaller life in some ways, but apparently a more honest one. A year after Elena and I married, I donated the Sterling Industries building to the city, with the stipulation that the 46th floor be converted into a literacy center. The conference room where I'd confronted Mia and David became a library. The office where I'd sat behind that mahogany desk became a classroom where adults learned to read. Sometimes I would visit the building and sit in the back of those classes, watching students work through the same struggles that had once seemed insurmountable. Elena would catch my eye from the front of the room where she was teaching, and we'd share a smile that held everything I'd learned about the difference between success and fulfillment. I still owned companies, still made more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, but the wealth had become a tool rather than a goal, a means of creating the kind of programs Elena and I believed in, rather than accumulating possessions that impressed people I didn't particularly like. On our second anniversary, Elena and I were sitting in our small garden, reading in the evening light, when she looked up from her book and said, "Do you ever miss it? The other life?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about the house in Westchester with its designer everything and its underlying emptiness, about the marriage that had looked perfect from the outside while slowly suffocating both of us on the inside. "I miss the person I thought I was," I said finally, "but I don't miss the person I actually was." "Who do you think you were?" "Someone who believed that if I just worked hard enough, earned enough, achieved enough, I could make someone love me the way I wanted to be loved." I closed my book and looked at her. This woman who'd married me, knowing exactly who I was, rather than who I might become. I spent 30 years trying to be worthy of love, instead of just accepting that I was already worthy. Elena reached for my hand, her skin warm from the evening sun. "What changed?" I thought about that day in the lobby, about the moment when Mia had poured food on my shirt, and I'd felt something inside me finally break free from the need to prove myself to someone who would never see my worth. "I stopped trying to earn what should have been freely given," I said, "and I started looking for someone who gave it freely." As the sun set over our small garden, over the life we'd built together from honesty instead of expectations, I felt the kind of peace that comes not from getting everything you want, but from discovering that what you actually need is much simpler and much more achievable than you'd ever imagined. At 61 years old, I was finally living the life I'd always been worthy of.